Hey everybody, welcome to Calling All Devs, the series where we take questions from you, the Star Citizen community, and pose them directly to our developers. On this show, we got something a little different, a little special. It's October, it's Halloween time, it's spooky time, and we, of course, are going to talk about Death of a Spaceman. Now, Death of a Spaceman was first introduced back in 2013. We are going to get the update on where we're at now, where we're going forward, and to do so, we have two esteemed guests with us in no particular order. We got Richard Tyrer from the Core Gameplay Group. Hi, Richard.
Hello, how's it going?
And this is Chris, right?
That is right.
Chris?
Yes. The reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated, is what I would think would be the appropriate thing to be said here.
It's been a while since we've chatted. So this one's probably going to go a little bit long. Whatever. We're all very loquacious. So I'm going to sit back. Let's jump into this. Death of a Spaceman as a primer. Let's introduce it to people. We haven't talked about it in a while. Just what is it?
The idea with Death of the Spaceman is to try to get some kind of meaningful consequence to dying in a game. So, like, most games you play, modern games anyway, you die, you respawn back, a few seconds before you die, and you keep on doing it again. So it doesn't really feel like there's much consequence to dying, and a lot of times your gameplay approach is pretty sloppy. I mean, like, I know when I'm playing a standard FPS shooter in the story mode, I just keep blasting into people. I don't really think about it. I die, I start again. Whereas if you play, a game like, say, for instance, Demon's Souls, all the years ago, and all the ones past it, there's real consequence. I mean, you die, and you've got to fight back through all those enemies. You've lost all the experience that you've gained, the souls, in the case of Demon's Souls. But the thing with Demon's Souls, and it was one of the things I was playing, it reminded me of the good old, the days in the 80s and the 90s when you'd make games, and dying was had a real consequence. You wanted to finish your level before you died, or else you had to do the level again, right? So and consequently, when you finished the level or achieved something, you really felt proud and happy doing yourself, which is definitely I think one of the mechanics that makes Demon's Souls and its subsequent games so both infuriating and rewarding when you manage to do it. So kind of the idea was like, what kind of consequence can we have in our persistent universe in terms of, how do we encourage the players to stay alive? How do we encourage the players to keep their ship or repair the ship intact? We don't want people to just go, oh, I got a scratch, I'm just going to respawn in a perfectly, pristine state for, the character or the ship. And so Death of the Spaceman was sort of an idea to give an association with your player character in the game, in terms of this is who you are, and you want to keep yourself alive as possible, as much as possible, and identify with your avatar as an actual real person and character, and you care about, and you want to keep alive. And then, finally, when you've had one too many close calls or lost one too many battles, you no longer can be resuscitated, and you have to pass on essentially to your next of kin, which will have you call out basically who your next of kin is when you're sort of doing your character creation. And that idea is whether it's passing it down to your son or your daughter or a relative or a friend or whatever it would be, you call that out, and when that does, your possessions and reputation kind of pass down, but not all of them, right? So there's always, there's inheritance tax, and there's, the sins of the father aren't fully invested on the son, but there's a little bit of that. And so, the idea would be, you would want to, live as long and a healthy life as possible before you pass on to your progeny or whatever. And so that was the inspiration of Death of the Spaceman, to really give a sense of kind of close association with your avatar and your character. And if at the end of the day you've got to be there at your essentially the God view of the funeral of the character that you spent a year or so adventuring around Star Citizen, there should be a tear in your eye when it happens. And so that was the goal. And so it was really a mechanic of how can we do that inside the game, inside our science fiction setting, which was coming up with this concept of in the future, with all the medical science we have, in states that you may consider you would be dead now, you would not be able to be brought back to life or repaired. potentially we could do that in the future, but maybe we could only do it so many times. And so, in some ways, it's a little like the old school of you've got so many lives, right? And once your lives are done, the game's over. And the concept was that the maybe the more the worse the death, you're in some big fireball. That's more serious in terms of the lives you lose off your character than it would be if you were down and bleeding out and someone came and got you and managed to repair you, or, fix you up in a medical table or a hospital. And the idea would be, you would want to not run out of lives, and potentially there could be things you could do over time, go get some gene therapy or whatever that maybe add a life back to you or whatever. But I'm talking lives in a gamer sense here, but in general, we're trying to put it inside the fiction of the world. But the idea is to have real persistence to your avatar and wear and tear. It's also one of the reasons why we've got things like wear in the game. It's essentially one of the things that we have for equipment. We're gonna have for characters. You're gonna get older. Things are gonna get old, and all of that. We have parts of that in the game, but it's not fully working. But that's all systems that are on the plan, or we need to turn on properly, because that's part of the problem with what we're doing right now. Is we're building this incredibly complicated, interconnected sort of simulation system, and not all the pieces are there quite yet. So even though we built some of the pieces and we can functionally do stuff with them, because the other pieces aren't there, the whole system doesn't work yet. And that is actually one of the challenges of building a game the way we're building it, sort of while people are playing it and we're building it. Death of Spaceman is a good example, because it's something that I talked about at the very beginning as a core concept. It's always been a core concept, but we're only just now getting around to starting to implement the actual functionality and the gameplay features that will enable it. And I think when you have it, that will make people behave very differently in the verse, which is going to be super cool.
Yeah. Now, you buried the lead there at the end. That's big news. We are now beginning the process of actively putting this into development. It's been this idea, it's been this core tenet of Star Citizen's character since it was first introduced. You just gave us a wonderful refresher, so the page is still on the website. If you haven't read it, you want to read even more detail, you can check that out, but that basically brings everybody up to speed with where we're at here. Now, Richard, we are beginning the process of putting these things into active development, of that process where we're going to start working on it, start testing these ideas, building our Tier 0 implementations. Where do we start?
So, well, we've already kind of started. So body dragging was the first feature that we released that kind of gave you the premise to be able to manipulate, dead bodies. But as Chris calls out, death is going to be a really important factor in Star Citizen. Now, death, there's kind of three deaths along the spectrum. There's kind of what we're calling like the down state. So that's kind of like when your health has gone to 0 and you're there. And when you're in that scenario, you'll be able to kind of choose to kind of stay there and be like, okay, I need my buddies to come and rescue me. I need the, law enforcement to come and help me, or maybe I've paid for some insurance that rescues my body or something like that. Then there is the kind of like you've died in terms of you've given up the ghost, nobody's coming. You're like, okay, that's it. I'm leaving that body there, and I'm going to go back to a hospital and be revived. But that's kind of part of your DNA. That DNA is kind of going to be reimpregnated into essentially a clone of you. And then you'll be able to then go back to your location, and you'll be able to see, your dead body there. And as long as nobody's been there, you'll be able to retrieve your gear and so on and so forth. And then the third aspect in terms of like you passing on to your next of kin and that kind of thing. So what we're actually evaluating now is kind of how this is integrated into kind of like the core healing gameplay and the actor status. So we already did kind of some of the actor status with, temperature in terms of hypothermia and hyperthermia and things like, starvation and things. And what we want to do now in terms of the next iteration of this is what we call like the healing and actor status T1. And what that will do is introduce drugs. So you'll have a blood drug level and you'll be able to manipulate things, but it will also introduce all the different statuses that are surrounding you as a character. So for example, when you're in battle and you take a really bad wound to the arm, you might say, okay, I've got a fracture, so my arm, I've got a permanent fracture. I'd have to go back to the hospital to get that repaired. Otherwise, I'm going to start to suffer some status effects that is surrounding that. But if you keep taking damage and you keep taking more damage, that fracture might turn into an actual break, and then it might turn into actually coming out of your arm kind of thing. And the level of that status will dictate the level of cover and level of healing that you need to get to go and basically get that healed, so you can go to a med bay and get them repaired. But it also allows other people to act as like support roles and come to say help you. And let's say you've got a really bad broken leg, which means that you can't walk anymore because you haven't just like fallen over and taken a little scratch. You've repeatedly taken damage in your leg and not gone you've not gone to heal it, because medipens, for example, will no longer just be like, oh, I'm a medipen, I'm full health. You will have these permanent statuses like hypothermia and hypothermia, and so you'll have to have those will only be able to be removed when you go to these locations, either a medical bay in a ship or a medical bay at these hospital locations. So when essentially you go into that downed state, that's where body dragging will come in, so that people can come in and drag your body back to the medical facility. We're going to have obviously the medical gun in terms of the multi-tool attachment. We'll be able to inject essentially the material that's inside the medipens, but a stronger version of that. So the medipens will basically turn into something that is kind of stabilizing you in the moment. You'll still be able to like replenish your health, but if you've got a bleed or something like that, it'd be like a clotting agent that stops that bleed, and that kind of allows you to get back to safety. And at that moment in time, you can then go, okay, do I want to push on? But I've got this status effect that's kind of, causing, if I go back to the fracture arm, my weapon's now swaying more. And, similar to how we had the eyeball effects for the other things. And that progression of the active status T1 in terms of the different limb statuses that you're going to have in terms of whether you've got a traumatic brain injury, whether you've got leg injuries, whether you've got arm injuries, whether you've got internal bleeding in terms of your organs, the level of those statuses will basically go up and go up to the point of view where you're like, I can no longer function now, and I need somebody to come out. And you'll have plenty of opportunity to back out. So it's not going to be something that's going to be like, oh, hello, you've broken your legs, and that's it. It's going to be something like the other active statuses that is like, okay, you're going to have junction points where you can make a decision where you're like, should I go on? And it's that moment like in the Arctic, I'm close to the edge, but I might lose my toes. So, if essentially what we're working on right now is that kind of like healing circle and that healing gameplay. And it also allows that cooperative gameplay that when you do go into this down state, which covers like it's the first version of the 3 death states kind of thing, that's the state where you really you don't want to go to the next stage, because as soon as you go to the next stage, that is what Chris touched on in terms of like, it's almost like the DNA integrity, because you're going to go to the hospitals. When we release this, it'll be your hospitals will be live in the locations. You'll be able to go to these hospitals and almost like download your DNA matrix into the hospital database and say, okay, like if my body is unrecoverable or my friends can't get to me, then I'm gonna kind of die and have to be recloned into this body. That my DNA is going to have to be re-imprinted into this shell. And during that process, that's the process where your DNA can kind of fracture or kind of lose some of its integrity. And that is kind of what Chris touched on in terms of like, you're losing a life in terms of gameplay terms. So, and that is what's happening as it's being imprinted into you. And depending on the manner of your death, and depending on like, oh, if you've just been ignoring all of these statuses and all of your arms don't work and your legs don't work and you've got a brain bleed, some of that DNA integrity as it's being injected back into your body can be re-inherited from those basically systemic statuses that you've had. And that means that you might come back in your body with a prosthetic arm, or you might come back that your eye color has changed, or you're not as tall as you used to be, and because there's something that's gone wrong with that DNA imprinting. So that's kind of what we're working towards now in terms of that hospital healing gameplay loop, active status, the extension of the active status system that we went live with before, and obviously body dragging and all of that kind of setting your spawn point in terms of game terms and the live. That's the stuff that we're working on right now. And to be honest, that's going to be a significant change in how people play the game, because when you go to the next or the third stage, where you're shedding your tear, I'm not shedding my tear at the character I've lost. I'm shedding my tear at the inheritance tax that I've just been levied. And it's at that stage, that permanent death where you're having to pass on to your next of kin, where it is the sins of the father. You're still going to have some of your reputational statuses, but they may not be as high as they were, because it's like, oh, your dad was part of XYZ, but you're going to have to prove yourself. And so and that kind of loop is a really unique aspect in terms of an MMO, and that really ties into that death has a real meaningful consequence. Like in Demon's Souls, the amount of times you get to the boss and you're like, you get to that 1%. and your palms are sweaty, and you're moving the mouse, and you're like, no, that all of a sudden changes. When you get to the edge of that cave, and you're like, yeah, I'm just gonna go in there, and if I find something in there that's not friendly to me, then I'll just respawn. No, now it's gonna be like, well, if I respawn, what happens to my ship? Am I going to lose my gear? I'm going to have to come back to it, because obviously physical inventory ties into it, and then will I lose some of my DNA integrity, and how's that? And all of a sudden, it changes the choices you make along the journey that you're going on, and that is critical.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other things we're doing is that we're not going to be despawning player bodies anymore. So when you die, the body that's there and all the equipment will stay there. So if you end up having to be sort of recloned, you could essentially go back to where you died and recover some of your stuff and see the skeleton of your previous incarnation. But the other thing I would say is that the cost of sort of the new life, basically, and you're only going to have so many of these because they degrade, is much more than getting rescued or having someone come and grab you and fix you up. So there will also be an economic incentive to live, to essentially not just go, oh yeah, I'm just going to respawn, because A, you're only going to get a very limited number of those, and B, they're going to be very expensive. So you would prefer to have other players or your friends or a service come and get you and fix you up. And I think that'll be really useful and important, because like even in gameplay, okay, if I'm now exploring in a corner of the universe that doesn't really have a lot of people, my level of risk there is much higher than if I'm in the middle of a really well-traveled area of space. I think in terms of gameplay, things like finally getting around to the full sort of health, death of a spaceman setup and the physical inventory, the gameplay potential and just what's going to happen and the interplay with players is there's not other games that I think of that quite have all this stuff all together to do this at this level of detail. And I personally, I just think I'm super excited to have these come together. I mean, we talked about them for a long time. Obviously, it's taken a while, but that's because we're building something incredibly high fidelity with all this detail, but with all this scope. But it really will change a lot of the gameplay mechanics. A lot of how people are playing the game right now, just you wouldn't want to do. It just wouldn't make sense. And I think that's super exciting.
Yeah. And hopefully you can see some of the method to the madness of the development, because it's not like, hey, overnight we go, hey, let's just add this cool thing. It's like, okay, it's underpinning these things. So when we add like actor status, when we add eating and drinking, when we add physical inventory, when we add the ability to hold things in the hand from the grenade from throw T1, all of that is tying into the bigger picture of what we want to achieve. And that core gameplay loop of, I'm not just stepping into my ship and flying into space and I could just open my PMA and just have access to everything I want. And, there's no consequence. There's no feeling of that you're in the world because of, you have this access to this infinite bag of holding. This consequence of I'm going on a real adventure. The things that I take with me are the things that I have access to. The ships that I have dictate how much storage I have and how much, what I have access to inside those ships. Do I have a kitchen that provides me food and drink? Do I have a medical bay? Am I got room to take a buddy with me? Is he going to wear support armor that allows more replenishment of the medical gun that can revive me when I'm down in the cave and we can get out together? All of a sudden that becomes not just a single player, I've just got access. All of a sudden those shared experiences are the things that make it a true experience. And that is something that all of these individual systems, in isolation, they're really cool, and we put a lot of effort and a lot of heart into them, and they're complex because we want it to be scalability on a size of Star Citizen. But when you pull them all together and they start talking to each other and they start, okay, have you got space for the amount of food and drink you need? Have you got space for ammo? What guns are you taking? Am I going to take the grenade launcher? Well, I can only fit so many, magazines of that. Well, maybe I should take an energy rifle because that recharges. And all of those different decisions, all of that ties into making it, that's when all of a sudden you go, hold on a minute. The game was already there. We just needed to have these systems start talking to each other.
I feel like at some point we need to rebrand this to the life and death, and then in parentheses, and taxes of a spaceman. It would be the more appropriate.
Ultimately, we do joke a little bit about, but the goal with Star Citizen is to, essentially it's a virtual life. And we are trying to simulate, or obviously in a more primitive state than the real world, but simulate all the things that would happen. Like naturally, you would think, okay, if I'm going to go to the Antarctic, I've got to bring my supplies with me. I got to worry about if I get hurt and all these things that I think create great gameplay opportunities, and also great cooperative gameplay opportunities, right? So there's a lot of things that we talked about that clearly, if you're going to be adventuring in a dangerous place, having the equipment and having people with you is probably a good thing, because otherwise something goes wrong, you're by yourself. And so I feel like when we get a lot of, there's been a lot of engineering just on the very low level and some scalable stuff that we have to do to enable a lot of these systems. And, but over the next year or 2 years, we've got a lot of this stuff sort of coming online. And I feel like when they all start interoperating together, that it will be an experience like no other. I don't know another game that does it to the level. There's some games that do, some really nice. Red Dead Redemption 2 is great. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that sort of does elements of this, but I think not to the scope and the level and the detail that we're doing. And that's one of the reasons why it's taking so long. So that is, it's definitely taking longer than I'd like it to do, and it's part of my frustration when people are like, well, where's my gameplay loops? And I'm like, but it's going to be so awesome. You've got all these elements, and I know the big picture. I know how they're all going to pull together. And it's just one of the things that when you're making a game live, developing in front of people, that people experience you wouldn't normally. Like normally, most game developers will tell you in the old way. So it certainly was when I was making the Wing Commanders and all the rest of stuff. And Richard probably can opinion on when on all the ones that he was making. That the game really only comes together near the end, right? So you work on all these disparate parts, and you do it for years. Especially in today's world, people will work on it for years and years and years, and then it really only comes together sort of kind of in that sort of alpha to beta stage. And we're sort of, I know we say we're alpha, but we still got a lot of features to come. And normally a traditional alpha would be you've got your features there, but you don't have all your content polished, and then beta is all content and features are in there, and you're working on the bugs. So a lot of it doesn't. Wing Commander, you weren't playing through until a couple of months before we released the game, and it was all in different pieces. But in the way we do Star Citizen, people see us develop all these pieces in different parts, and they go, well, why you got that? That just seems silly that you're focusing on this aspect over here when I don't have this other thing over here. Well, we have a plan. They're all working. We're working on all those pieces, and when they all come together, it's going to be a great experience. You already there's elements of it now, so you can sort of go around an event, run around the verse, and yes, there's going to be a lot more, but there's already fun stuff to do, and there's the social aspect of it. And I see amazing videos every single day. It's like one of the funnest things for me to see cool videos by whoever. Like there was one that Terada just did, and on 311 that was shared around here, and there was someone. Anyway, the point is, this is really cool stuff that people are doing with the sandbox we're building, even though the sandbox isn't finished. But whether it's me or Richard or Todd Pappy or Tony Zurovec, we're all operating at the level of we see the matrix. We just haven't built all the elements of the matrix yet. But we know it's coming together, and when it's done, it'll be like this amazing simulation. And our only frustration is because it's not like me and Richard are like, oh yeah, guys, take longer. It's like me and Richard and Todd and everyone else are like, is it really going to take you that long to do that feature? You sure you can't do that in half the time? So we're always on their case. So I know everyone out there is on our cases, but it's sort of like we're on the other way around. But some of this stuff just takes time to build it, to test it, and also to do it when you're doing it in a live game, right? Because we are building in a live game, so you can't just break everything by introducing a new feature. You've got to make sure the old features work as well. But to be honest with you, it's actually a fun way to do it, because a lot of how we're doing it also informs our development as we go along. Because yes, we've got our big plans, but some of the feedback we get helps tweak how things are coming in, or what areas we'll address, or what things worked well or what things didn't work well that we need to adjust. And if you were doing it the old way, you wouldn't get that feedback. You'd just basically put it all out there. It'd be your best shot at it, and then you'd be like, oh shit, well, we gotta fix this thing or improve this thing, and so I like it. And also just people experiencing what we're building so far is awesome for the team as well, because the team they get all inspired when they see cool stuff that the community is doing. So there's upsides and downsides to what we're doing, but I wouldn't change it for the world, because I think it's one of the funnest things I've ever done in games, and it's awesome.
Talking about reading The Matrix, and I'm just like, yeah, I'm the guy sitting here for 6 years now trying to do an online correspondence course, how to read The Matrix. Every week, just, I gotcha. We are at time at this point. The wonderful thing about interviewing either Chris or Richard is that I come with all these questions, and I only ever have to ask one, because then they just kind of just hit everything. I'm like, I don't have to ask that. I don't have to ask that. Before we let you go, just one final thing. For some folks, this is going to be kind of a new idea. For many folks, they've been following along with this since 2013. As Richard said, we're building this out actively. We have been. All of these actor feature things are all laying the groundwork. They're all the foundation for this. When this is done, it's not going to be like a big switch. There's not going to be one day there's not Death of a Spaceman, and then the next day there is Death of a Spaceman. These things will come in iterations, just like anything else does. Tier 0 of cybernetics, Tier 0 of hospital, stuff like that. One last bit of expectation setting. Without giving dates or anything, what can people expect going forward? How do we go from here? What's the plan from here, generally speaking?
I'll let you take this, Richard, so I don't get in trouble.
Yeah, okay. So what we're planning on working on in the future, so relatively soon, shall we say, is kind of the hospital groundwork. So the hospitals in the locations, the ability for you to be able to go to those hospitals and kind of download your DNA is kind of like your save point, or kind of like the area where you would be respawned. We already obviously have body dragging in and some of the medical bays in there, but what we'll be introducing is active status T1. So that will be drugs. So for example, we'll be introducing some drugs as part of that. So like adrenaline. I think we've already got some black market drugs in there that will tie into this, but also like alcohol. So if you go to the bartender, you'll be able to get drunk, and we'll have the relevant animations and locomotion sets that tie into that. Because obviously then there'll be a risk reward that you can't just keep medipenning like you can't in real life. You can't just keep popping paracetamol, all of that kind of thing will kind of tie into it in terms of that blood drug level. And that will, if you keep taking drugs, you will eventually, overdose and you'll need to be revived. So you'll have to manage that on that actor status side of things. And we'll also be introducing the healing loop in terms of those being able to revive you from a down state. And obviously that in the DNA integrity side of things. So as you basically die, you'll be able to have battle through revive, so we can bring you back in the same body, and that is obviously you'll be there, but you may come back with you may have a permanent visuals, but that won't be part of T0, the visuals, just to be clear. But yeah, so that's kind of what we're working on, that core gameplay loop, actor status T1, and hospital locations. Those are the three main big kind of like areas that we're trying to push forward on, and hopefully alongside physical inventory, which is we're also actively working on. I mean, I've done multiple talks on, and I think every patch we do something to do with either updating the UI, and all of that is in along the journey. We've just been releasing small bits, but that will tie into it. So kind of like healing active status, hospitals, and physical inventory, those kind of things will kind of come, hopefully kind of come as one thing to be able to deliver that experience. But if they don't, then we'll make it work as they come. But that's kind of the stuff we're actively working on right now.
All right. And then one more follow-up. Earlier you said that sometimes when you res, you might come back shorter. Were you just giving an example, or are you confirming short characters?
I was giving an example. Definitely not confirming.
People were going to grab onto it, and there was going to be a Reddit thread, so I had to ask. All right. Thank you, guys, so much. I'll let you go. Take care.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone.
Have a good one. Bye-bye.